UMass Amherst, so not so far from here. Before here at Amherst, he was at Nevada Press, University of Nevada Press. He also worked at Wayne State. That deal with social justice and equity. It also acquires regional trade titles on New England topics. It's an in-house editor for the series Activist Studies of Science and Tech, African American Intellectual History, Childhoods, Interdisciplinary Perspectives of Children and Youth, Culture and Politics in the Cold War and Beyond, and more. And he has worked with a lot of our English master's program, who now teaches in the history department, Ross Cooley, and also he works in archives at the library. So that's pretty exciting. And before I introduce the next person, Matt, you were talking about the African American. Is this the same imprint or the same series that the African American Intellectual History, or is that a different series?
Of the Society?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's
Okay.
the same as with Chris Cannon,
Okay.
the guy who founded it. So.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yep.
All right.
Chris is from New Hampshire.
And next we have Ladette Randolf. She is, right now, she's the editor-in-chief and director of Ploughshares, which is a literary magazine, and she will be that person until the 31st. She will retire. But before coming to Ploughshares, according to Ploughshares at Emerson, she was at the University of Nebraska Press, which is one of the biggest university presses in the country. That's where I met Ladette. She was my hero because she was very smart and she always dressed nice. So she's the author of 5 books, including Private Way, which I think is your newest one, right? Hella's Wake and the San Hills Ballad, a short story collection, Time to Tropics, and the memoir Leaving the Pink House. She's the recipient of 4 Nebraska Book Awards, a Ronald Jaffe Grant, a Pushcart Prize, Virginia Faulkner Award, and a citation for Best New American Voices. As I said, she's at Ploughshares right now, but she also co-owns a manuscript consortium firm with Heather Lindy. Yeah, okay. And she grew up in, were you born in Nebraska?
I wasn't born in Nebraska, but I grew up in Nebraska.
So she grew up in Nebraska and she moved to England about 15, 16 years ago. Okay. So those are those two. I also have Connie Strittmatter, who is a librarian here at Michigan State. She's been up to also plays, and Professor Ben Lieberman, Dr. Lieberman, who is a history professor and just in all of them. Got your bios. I like gather them in today. So before I start, oh, look at that. Oh wait. Tech 2 minutes. Okay. What's going on?
It needs to be put on mute.
So it's out.
So I'm gonna ask a few questions and then I am going to let you guys ask questions and might have questions from each other. Earlier, Ladette, Matt, and I were having coffee and they did have questions and had great conversations. And I felt so lucky to be a part of it. And I am, wait, before I start that, I am going to, before I get to you two, I'm gonna ask Ben to talk about his experiences with coaching and writing.
Thanks. I don't want to take too much time. And I've just had a lot of experiences in different phases. So I've published monographs, trade book, textbooks, articles. I've been through a lot of different parts of the publishing process. And I would say that my main takeaway is that they're somewhat different, in terms of, what the goal is. And it's important if you're interested in working in one sector to have a good idea about what those differences are. But I would also say that no matter what area it is, there's pretty high standards. So, textbooks are reviewed, right? peer reviewed as well as monographs. And so that's an important thing I learned. Peer reviewed, interesting process. A lot of people have been through it, and I think probably revise and resubmit is a very typical experience. And my main one takeaway is for people not to get discouraged and to continue with the process. And if they get revise and resubmit, not to go into a hole, but to actually look at it. That doesn't mean though that you have to accept every single point. So you can sometimes talk to the managing editor. For example, if you get back some feedback after submitting a manuscript for an article, and there's, especially if there's a contradiction between the peer reviewers, right? One peer reviewer says one thing and a second peer reviewer says something else. It can actually be literally impossible to satisfy both of them. And so sometimes you can communicate with the managing editor to kind of come up with a plan to navigate that, especially if the combined device doesn't seem to make sense. That's something that I've also learned. There is some, in other words, some give and take in the peer review process. It's not just, oh, we dictate this, therefore you have to do that. And I won't say any more now, just to kind of save time for our speakers.
So I'm gonna ask Connie at the end about acquisitions and stuff, but I'm gonna first ask Ladette and Matt and whoever wants to go first. Can you describe your role or your previous roles in the publishing world?
Let's see, I'm the editor-in-chief there, so I'm in acquisition. So we acquire the projects. I like to think of this as research and development. So we're kind of R&D, so we research the various subject areas and then we go out and find the projects. And there's many ways we do that. And go to conferences, that's a big way. We'll go through the programs to kind of look at what people are writing on. And as most presses will have subject area strengths, so we're going to conferences. At Massachusetts, and this is a lot of university presses, we're very focused on history. But we do African American studies, we do public history, and different university presses will have different strengths. So I go to conferences that are germane to our subject areas. So the main thing is I acquired the projects and kind of direct the editorial program. So if there's new directions we want to go into, I will make the case to the director, my colleagues, and even to our press committee about, we should, I launched a series on journalism and democracy. We didn't have, we weren't doing that in a dedicated way. We had some stuff in the backlist, but one of the faculty came and pitched this series to me, and I was like, that's a good idea. So, it's kind of, I kind of help direct and build and envision the editorial program. And apart from that, I oversee the peer review. I do some development with the manuscript, although if you go with a university press, you're usually not going to get a lot of editorial assistance from the acquisitions editors. You'll get it from the copy editors usually. You could chime in here, but we usually will do developmental edit stuff, which is like global things like your introduction's too long, cut it down by half. Get rid of your, lit review, that kind of stuff. And then a million other things. And it really kind of shakes out. UMass Press is a small press. There's like 6 of us, I think. So when you talk about small presses. So I end up wearing a lot of hats. I write copy, negotiate contracts, do a lot of that kind of stuff too. And that can get into this a little bit more. Presses, there's like main areas in all presses. There's acquisitions. There's what we call EDP, editorial design and production. That's where your book is actually made. So the acquisitions acquire it, kind of the front end, or the honeymoon period is what I often think. Like when we pass it off, the honeymoon's ended. Then the authors start to go, wait a second. Editorial design and production, they make it. They'll be marketing with the press. There'll be a director. They're the ones that oversee the kind of overall operation. There's a business division to presses. And then they can shake out in different ways. Sometimes the press will have like a developmental officer that will be just dedicated to fundraising, or a tech person like that. But the main ones are usually that authors are most concerned about are going to be acquisitions, editorial design and production, and marketing. Those can scale up depending on the size of the press. So we have one person for each, but in Nebraska, acquisitions has probably 4 editors in the acquisitions and an editor in chief, right? So that's basically what I do.
So I did the same thing. I was in acquisitions and in administration at Nebraska, which had 70 employees when I was there. And big press or big warehouses. So it was a big press. But what we do is still the same. And I think of acquisitions editors as, I like what Matt said about, you have faculty members who come and suggest something. And so we would get suggestions from people, scholars that we would meet at conferences, and they would say, you guys should do this. And I always think of us as curious people, and we recognize talent in other people. That's how I always felt like I could spot the kind of smart person, and or someone that was onto something new. And so we're sort of the curious people in the press. And we can usually see great promise in something in its raw state. We can see it from a presentation at a conference or from an article that we've read, and we can see that this person maybe has more to say about this. And so that is a lot about relationships and forming relationships. Books develop over many years in some cases. Other times someone sends a proposal or a query, and they have a finished manuscript and it fits really well with what we do. So I'm going to just jump ahead here a little bit and say that after you've done all your research for your book and you've worked so hard and researched so much, don't stop when it comes to looking for your press. Because the presses publish, there's overlap, but they also publish really different things too. And we call those lists. And so if you do some research, look at the past 5 years, that's probably a good kind of idea to know what they're publishing now, not what they published 20 years ago. And send strategically, and think about maybe some of the books on your research, when you were doing your research. Where were the most recent books published? Who's really known in that area? So Nebraska was known for Western history and for Native American studies, but it was also known for translations in 5 European languages. And it was known for Willa Cather's studies, but also for the letters of Henry James. So, huge lists and a lot of diversity. But you have to do your research to know that. So go to the website, look at their books. And so that's a little detour, but a little bit of advice. So now for the last 16 years, and for the first 4 years when I was starting out in publishing, I worked in literary journals, which are very different. And I don't think that there's a lot of similarity in literary journals and scholarly journals. So I can't be too helpful there, I don't think. But if any of you, and I get submissions from all over the world, from people in all walks of life. It's really interesting to me. The cover letters are fascinating. And I do get a lot of submissions from people who are scholars. And in some cases we publish them. So it's very competitive. But if there is interest, if someone here, I know you have creative writing department, so maybe someone here is in creative writing and I can help if you're interested in those submissions. But I have been out of university press publishing for 16 years. I mean, I remember the process and I don't think it's changed in 16 years that much. And I know what it is with peer reviews. And as an acquiring editor, I would have helped my authors to split the difference between competing reviews. So, helping them shape their response and being their advocate to the board and to the rest of the house, because that's what we continue to do. We still are the first love of the person that's going through this experience. And if we have good relationships with other departments in the press, they trust us. And if we come and we say, hey, that cover's just really not going to work, they're going to respect us. So a lot of what you want in an acquiring editor is to be a good champion for you through that process. So.
It's interesting about researching the press, and I do. For those of you who know me, I am a creative writer, and I write papers, but I only present them. I'm way too afraid to try to publish them. But this is the same thing with creative writing. Like, and I tell my students this: like, don't send genre fiction to a place that is only gonna take literary or only publishes literary fiction. And the same thing we do when we look at schools to apply to, see who's there, see what's there. So that's all good advice. For emergent scholars and or people returning to placing scholarship, can you talk about the submission process? You can talk about it.
So I mean, the main, as Ladette said, the main thing is go to the web pages, because all presses will have their submission kind of guidelines on the web page, and they're pretty much similar. We want a proposal. Usually, I want a proposal. And it, as Ladette said, you know, it really depends on. We do develop these relationships with people. If I get a proposal from somebody I've worked with for a long time, I'll be like, yeah. Even if they don't have a manuscript necessarily, I'll be like, great. Or if they have, you know, a reputation in whatever the field is, that's going to help. But if you're a new, if this is your first time around, they'll have the submission guidelines on the web page. So go there. I would also encourage people to try to meet with editors. In fact, I tell new first-time authors all the time, as Ladette said, I mean, we are your advocate in-house. And I'm like, so before, and you can submit, you can send you can propose to as many presses as you'd like. You can send the proposal to as many presses as you like. And I will point out, once a press says, hey, I'm interested, I invite the full manuscript, they're going to probably expect exclusivity unless you talk with them, because then we start to put time and effort into it. I've had this happen a couple times, so I make very clear, it's like, if you send me your manuscript, like, then, you know, I want exclusivity unless we talk. But, you know, because the editors are your advocates, I encourage first-time authors to go to conferences or to set up Zoom meetings with editors. And it's a little hippie, but I'm like, try to get the vibe. You know, it's a working relationship. You're going to be working with this person for however many years. And if you're not working directly with them, as Ladette said, you're going to be working with the rest of the press. And the acquisitions editor is going to talk to their colleagues and be like, this person's great. This person's going to be a little troubling. You know what I mean? We just communicate around that. Not in a bad way, but, you know, they're going to be very concerned about the cover or something like that. And sometimes we have to have conversations about the covers or the titles, because every press has the final say on the cover and the title, because they're marketing tools. And authors don't oftentimes see them that way, but we do. And we think about in keyword terms and searchability and all that kind of stuff. And authors, they don't always think that way. It's got to fit on the page. You know what I mean? The cover's got to have enough space so the title pops and all that kind of stuff. So you're going to want an acquisitions editor who can have those conversations with you, who you're confident and comfortable with to have those conversations. And the other thing I'll say too, and I tell this to authors, if you don't meet an editor, or if you do meet an editor, and you're like, look, I want to have a conversation with you, I want to talk to you on the phone, I want to have a Zoom, and they don't do it, that's a red flag. Because you want somebody who's going to communicate with you all throughout the process, or at least at the beginning where you're in the acquisitions. You want to make sure that somebody's really communicating with you and like giving it to you straight. If I ever hear an acquisitions that are at like an academic conference and they're like, yes, you will be, you know, reviewed by the New York Review of Books, I'm like, run away. Run away, because it's probably not going to happen. I always say under promise and over deliver. Those are the kind of editors you want to find. And somebody who's really willing to sit down and talk. Like, I will explain the peer review process in detail to anybody that wants to hear it. And if they're not willing to do that, if you're a first-time author and they're not willing to do that with you, then I say, really think about going with that press, because there's going to be times in the process you're going to want that. So.
Well, that's very similar to what I would say. I think at Nebraska, and I don't know if it's changed, actually doing a proposal, which is a fairly in-depth, detailed thing to do, takes a lot of time. The only editor who accepted that kind of thing was our sports editor, who did a lot of trade books, and that was really more kind of common in the trade at the time. So we generally we got queries, which were one page. Here's who I am. This is what I'm doing, and this is why I think you're fit. And so that was usually how people, other than conferences, we got a lot of queries. A lot of people just sent their full manuscript and with a cover letter doing basically what a query would do, which, was kind of a waste of postage in a lot of cases. So, I was always fine with the query because I knew pretty much right away whether or not I wanted to look at that book. So there's that. I did not, Zoom wasn't a thing. So this is how old I am, or how long ago this is. But so there wasn't really that option to have that kind of long distance thing. Occasionally we talk on the phone, but usually I had a pretty good sense of someone, either from knowing them from conferences or knowing them kind of their reputation. I am a little bit sympathetic to the shy scholar because I think I'm a shy writer. And so I think that my personal affliction is that I would assume someone was being nice to me. If they said, oh, send me this, or give me a call, I would think that's not true. So that's me. I'm nuts. But I am to those scholars who would be shy. And what I found was that because I'm very approachable, I would be at very imposing conferences like the MLA, and people would come talk to me and they feel very comfortable and they would share about their project. And I learned a lot about them, and they assumed I was the marketing manager. Will the editor be here to talk later? And so, said a lot about them that I didn't think I could be the editor-in-chief. But, it's like, well, you just have been talking to her. And so in some way, to assume everybody is the marketing manager and just go talk to them, because in a lot of ways, you do need to think like the marketing manager, because this does have to go through the marketing manager. And it's not that they can kill it, but we're going to have to do that work. Mm-hmm. So if you help us do that work and think about the market, then you've already kind of given us a little boost. So it's about energy too. So a lot of it is just thinking about that process that you're going to be going through and what you're asking someone in our position to do. Yeah. So that's about it for me.
I remember being at Nebraska, I worked in the marketing department as a student worker. And one of the first meetings I was in, first of all, I was like, I'm in a meeting. But also, it may have even been you came to the marketing meeting and pitched the book after it was already accepted, after it pretty much went through editing, and told us about the author, the book, the background, everything. And then that's when I learned that title might not be the title that you. Well, I never, to this day, I still don't worry about titles. Like the title of my last book, which I wanted it to be awesome everywhere. And my editor is like, nope, all daughters are awesome everywhere. Like, okay. So I knew that what happened. That happened with my novel too. Very different title. My editor is just like, no, this is not gonna work. And she reread the book and was like, this is your title now. So. And it happens. Mm-hmm. So much happens beyond editing. It's kind of, I also heard at that time when I was at Nebraska, I think you said it, my boss, Margie said it, a dissertation is not a book. And probably a thesis is not a book too, but I know that you probably have heard that before. Can you explain what that means, that a dissertation is not a book?
I'm going to hand that.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And I actually brought a little guide if anybody wants it. I got a little dissertation of the book guide. Because I made one here. I made this years ago.
And I can post this online.
Yeah.
You should have your name.
Yes, sure.
I should.
See, as an inquiring editor.
I should
I'm
also.
thinking that.
I should.
Also
Yeah.
should chronicle.
At least get credit.
Also.
So, so at a very top level, I think about a dissertation, as I mentioned to you before, is it's fundamentally defensive. You're defending your knowledge to essentially 5 people, and you're showing that you know the field, and you know that person's going to ask something in about the dissertation. If it's not in there, you know they're going to say. So it's essentially kind of showing that you know the field, and this is. Dissertations have changed. People are trying to write them more like books, but historically it's still the case. They're defensive. Books, in some ways, and it sounds a little weird, are offensive. You're playing offense. So some of the things that you do in a dissertation, if you do in a book, it actually looks defensive. And so I caution about doing that because the one thing I want a book to do that a dissertation doesn't necessarily do is to maintain your authority in whatever it is. A dissertation, you're like, I'm nothing. I'm a grad student. I only know this because I read all these books. And we call it note madness. This is from Will Germano. You know, if I see a book and they're like got these footnotes that are this long, it's like, I trust that you've read all this. You don't have to put stuff that's from 1967. You know what I mean? Like we believe you. So that's what I mean. That can be a very kind of in a dissertation that makes sense because you have to demonstrate you know this literature. In a book, that looks defensive. It's like, I know this stuff because I read all these books. It's like, no, you know this stuff because you're an expert and because your thesis. So that's kind of a top level thing that I think, you know, that I see with a dissertation. And how that plays out is, like I said, with notes, we see it in the introductions a lot. Very kind of extensive lit reviews. You see that a lot. And they're what I call precious lit reviews. And so that they're like, I know this, I read this person, they taught me this. And I read this person, they taught me this. And I read this person, they taught me this. And it's like very precious, like how you know this. And that's a dissertation. In a book, I like it personally. My preference is when a scholar writes about a whole school of thought. You know, new left historians argued this, you know, and labor historians argued that. Maybe you individualize a few people in there because their ideas are so crucial. But it's like, I've read all these people. And this is what I think from these major currents of thought. That's again, a very kind of offensive move there. That doesn't look defensive. It's like, I know all these people. The other thing too that I'm jumping a little ahead, that with a pet peeve that I have is with dissertations, sometimes I have a hard time finding the argument and it takes a long time to get to the argument. So I'm always like, if I'm up to page 10 and I still don't know what you're arguing, that's a problem. So the kind of the most, I guess, offensive move or the most senior scholar move that I see, and I always tell people, you might as well do it right away. Like people are like, I'm a junior scholar. It's like, just do it now. Like, just pretend you're a senior scholar. Just go ahead. The ones that I see they make their argument and this is with a monograph. So this is when I look at a monograph. You know, the argument comes very soon within the introduction. I know exactly what they're arguing. It hits it hard. And I even like it when they go, in this book I argue. You know what I mean? Like, I like that because I'm like, okay, I know what your argument is. And then they kind of let it unfold. I think about a monograph as kind of like a murder mystery. And I know it sounds a little weird, but in a murder mystery, what happens? You get a murder right away. And then the rest of the pleasure of the book is unfolding how the murder happened. But it comes right away, usually in a murder mystery. And I think of a monograph as the same way. You get the argument right away, and the rest of the book is kind of understanding how that argument, your support, and how that argument unfurls. And the other thing I would just say too, and it goes along with the preciousness and the defensiveness is, and this is the introduction, and this would go with chapters too. If I'm reading an introduction and you name dropped 4 scholars or 10 scholars or even 2 sometimes before you get to your own argument, I recoil as an editor. It's like, own your argument. Don't give your authority away to other people before you tell me what your argument is. And you see that with dissertations a lot. You know, they're like, I'm going to tell you all this. Other people think this and this and this, and I just have this little tiny thought. You know, it's like, it doesn't really matter. You know, it's just sort of like, it's kind of important, but not really. These other people are more important. And that's a defensiveness. You know, with a book, I'm like, just, you own it. Own the information, own the argument. It's your work. You know, you're the expert, as I was saying to Ladette. You've convinced editors to put it through peer review. You've convinced the press to spend a lot of money producing it. You've convinced them to market it. You've convinced libraries to buy it. You've got bookstores. It's between 2 covers. When the reader picks it up, we trust that you're the expert. We go, this person's done a lot. They've got a book. They're the expert. And so if I start to read it, and I go, oh, I guess you're not. You know what I mean? It's only silly. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So there's not also, my first book was based on my dissertation, and I submitted it to some press, and they rejected it. And I had done the thing of name dropping all these big shots in the pre-on, and you know, defensive and all that. So there's one person I was name dropping and citing, and then I got the rejection. It was a little bit rejected. So some of my friends said, you know, you should contact this professor of ours who we know just to ask for some advice, right? So I contact this professor who's an expert in the field, and he sort of confesses, oh yeah, I was the person who said that we shouldn't publish it. And the thing that was hysterical is I thought I name dropped him, but I hadn't name dropped him. So it was the utility of that. Like, even though I was citing him, like, he wanted more. So there was no way to be defensive enough.
I think it's a really great example.
You know, that kind of stuff. It's like, there's pettiness, you know, when it comes to this. This is in broad strokes, but yeah, this is the differences, you know, between what I look for in a book and a dissertation. So, and I don't know if you have more.
I think that's great. Those are great.
Yeah. How much of a manuscript can be published, or what percentage of it, as articles or chapters, that is acceptable to? Yeah, how much can be published beforehand?
I can talk about it in terms of creative projects or even some trade projects.
Yeah.
That if significant amounts of it have been published, it does establish the credentials of the writer in creative writing. So we look at something where you've been published in Ploughshares, or you've published in, you know, Southern Review or whatever. Then we think, okay, well, this person putting together this story collection is recognized within the literary community. It's part of their platform. And so it helps me sell the book to the marketing department. And so that is, I think in scholarly projects, it was different. I think at the time when I was there, I don't know how it's changed now. But if too much of the book had been published, it was old news. And so what you want the book to do is to be kind of groundbreaking work. And so maybe people that have been at conferences with this person and people who've read some of their articles know the direction they're going, but they don't know everything. And I think that was important in a kind of a scholarly monograph. So that would be my advice, that if you're a creative writer, student.
For monographs, I mean, if more than 2 chapters out of it have been, most of the chapters have been substantially published, that's the limit. You know, I mean, I don't even really like that much.
Really?
Like, 1 chapter is fine, it kind of whets the appetite out there, but yeah, if you get too much published out of scholarly monographs, you know, if you really want to be strategic, you publish like a part of the chapter. You know, that's a little, like, that's a less problematic. But yeah, if it's like a part, like a whole chapter out of it that's been published as an article, like I would just want one, maybe two. It's so there's monographs are so broken up now anyway, in terms of how they're used. So chapters are used on their own all the time. Not that they haven't been for a long time, but even more so.
I do think it's a little different in various fields, though. That was changed.
Could be, yeah.
It had changed before that. If you're in sciences, of course,
Sure.
there are no monographs anymore
Right.
because
Sciences are
everything's
different.
published
Right.
electronically. It's very
Right.
fast. I think to the detriment, actually, of the field in many cases, but that's what's happening. And I don't know about business. It may be similar, where there's a kind of avenue or venue for publishing that's quite different than the book. So in that case, if you've been publishing, let's say, business articles in a certain way, and rather than gathering those as stale reprints of formerly published work, which I never think works anyway. I think it's kind of a bad idea. I've done it a few times, but I didn't love it. So pull something from that and turn it into a trade book. Turn it into something that your smart brother-in-law can read and appreciate, that isn't full of as much of the business jargon, isn't so much for your academic peers, but it's really for a wider audience. That would be my advice.
Yeah, that's a good point about different fields. They might be different in terms of I'm thinking in terms of humanities particularly. Even in social sciences, there's different.
It's changing fast.
Yeah, there were articles on much more the kind of route that people publish. But in terms of like, I get pitched them. I want to publish all these articles that I've been publishing over the past 20 years. I'm like, who are you? Like, I wouldn't even do that with most like big named people because all of that stuff is just freely available.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I think of it that way. If it's freely available, probably we're not going to be that interested in it.
Okay.
And if a lot of your book is, because so much is freely available now, if a lot of it's freely available, we're probably not that interested.
And I can see how it's a dilemma for scholars,
Right.
because you need to be publishing
Right.
for your advancement in the institution.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden now you need to start dancing backwards, so you've been performing as you were asked to perform for the academy, and then it says, yeah, but then you also need a book, and it's different kinds of things. So I think it's just, maybe thinking strategically, if you're publishing certain things to get credit for tenure or promotion, be thinking about the writers that you see who are succeeding, and look at how they are putting together their expertise. So, just maybe take it another little step from being the expert in your field to being public intellectual. How can I talk about this in a way that's accessible to other people? And maybe, I don't know if your institution will like that book as much. Maybe it's kind of, I think you kind of can't win for losing sometimes. But it depends on how flexible your administration is. And hopefully administrations are changing now and getting better about recognizing different kinds of books.
I think we're like a campus where like, oh my gosh, you published something. Yeah, I was very worried coming here. Most of us come here from R1 institutions, from grad school, and then you get here like, oh my gosh, I have to have how many books do you? And they're like, just our work towards publication. Yeah. So, we talked about the review process, and I kind of harp on that a little bit. How do you find your reviewers? I know I've reviewed books a few times, mostly textbooks, but.
So just with the review process, I always give a rah-rah speech to the authors that I encourage the authors to look at it in a very positive way. That what we're trying to do is make the end result the best book that we can make. So the review process, the peer review process, I think is like the number one stress test that we have. We're going to get two wicked smart people to read this manuscript who are content experts. I like to get readers who are come at things slightly different but overlap. So, for example, I have a book right now. I was talking about Black Springfield, where it's a history of Black Springfield, Massachusetts, but the church is at the center. So I've found a reader who knows African Americans in Western Massachusetts. There's not a lot of people out there, but I happen to know him. And then I'm going to get an expert on just the history of the Black church. So there's sort of kind of coming at two different angles on this manuscript is usually what I want to look at. The way I do it is I oftentimes will ask the scholar, I'm like, who should read this manuscript? And we'll have a conversation about the different angles if they agree. I'll say, give me the 6 names, contact information of people who fit this. I may or may not go with them. And also, very crucially, if anybody has this conversation, who should not read it? Because we all know that one person that was at that conference right there. Yep. Now, I always ask that too. Is there anybody who should not read this book because you don't want somebody to torpedo it for really petty reasons, which I've seen, and I usually will throw those out. But and I'll just mention too, all university presses have editorial board or a press committee. So we have a press committee at Massachusetts, and it's made up of scholars at the university. They're not content experts necessarily. I mean, one of them might happen to be we have somebody in African American studies. We do a lot of African American studies. Maybe they'll know that particular content, but in general, they're not content experts. Their role, though, is to make sure that the peer review happened correctly. We like to say they keep us honest. You know what I mean? So were the reviewers qualified? Once you get a peer review, the 2 peer reviews back, and there's some different ways the peer review can shake out that I can go into if you want, but you're going to be asked to write a response to the peer reviews, as I'm sure you did, outlining how you're going to revise in light of the peer reviews. At that point, you can disagree with something. I always say that's where you can say, this is a really good idea, but that's a different book, It becomes a little harder if both of the peer reviews say something. I find that then it's a little bit more hard because you've got 2 different people saying something. But the press committee is looking at the peer reviewers, your response. And the reason I bring this up is that's one of the constituent groups that I'm thinking about when I see the peer reviews. So sometimes I might get 2 peer reviews that say, we recommend publication for this project. But I look at it as the editor, and this is where you want to have a good relationship with your editor. I can read it and go, yeah, they recommend publication, but those are pretty significant revisions. I'm going to stop this right now, and it's going to be revised and resubmit. And part of the reason I'm doing that is because I know my press committee is going to see this and go, we're not going to accept this.
Okay.
This person needs to go make the revision. Then we need another round because we don't, there's too many questions here. That's what I mean. They look at the peer review process. So as editors, we're also thinking about that press committee when we're looking at these projects. Not that I wouldn't do that anyway, potentially, but and your editor should know the press committee well enough to know, they'll never go for that. Do you know what I mean? They're never going to go with this.
In some cases, if they trust you, you can
Sure.
ask for an advance contract, which is a little bit more substantial. It's a lot more substantial for the scholar. So it's a commitment, but it's trusting that they will revise and submit, and then they will go back for peer. Usually, it's 1 peer review when it's revised or when it's at that stage. So there are different strategies, and depending on your board, depending on how confident you are about the scholar, if they trust you. So
there's a lot. I mean, if that can be an advantage of being in a series. So Ladette talked about a list, and we think about lists, and we build lists. So we have an African American Studies list at Massachusetts. Usually what I think about with a series is a way to, and oftentimes is a way to further focus a list. So for example, we have African American Studies. I started a list on African American Intellectual History series, and it was a way we had a bunch of titles in African American studies, but I wanted to just do intellectual history. So I got Chris Cameron and we started the series. So what can happen with a series editor when it comes to peer review is if you get 2 peer reviews, and as long as they recommend publication, that we need 2 recommend publications. So that's a requirement. If one doesn't recommend publication, and the other one does, that's a different conversation potentially with your editor. But again, if you get 2, and I do this all the time, 2 recommend publications, but there's some significant revisions, the series editor can step in and write a memo to the press committee and say, I will do the final check on this manuscript. And the reason that's an advantage is because it can save you 6 months or a year. You know, you can keep the project moving along. It's like if it's got to go, if you got to do the revisions and then it's got to go for another whole round of peer review once the revisions come in, which can take 6 months. You know, you could be pushed back a whole season or 2 seasons for when your book comes out. So if you got a series editor that can say, I will do the final check, it can keep that process moving along.
We did it a little differently at Nebraska. Our series editors tended to be the first reviewer.
Okay.
So then, we had a second reviewer. So, if they wanted a good series, that carried a lot of weight for our board. But yeah, every press is different, so you never know. But I started a lot of series because of that, because I felt like there were areas that I really just did not have the reach to find the great books in that discipline. And so I had powerful series editors who were really well connected and respected in the field. So.
What are your pet peeves and proposals or manuscripts?
Well, I've already said
You said your pet
them, yeah.
I already said mine.
Okay, all right, so
The one I would say that Ladette brought this earlier is a pet peeve with proposals is getting, and I'm going to reiterate because it's very important, is getting proposals for like something that we don't do anything for. Like, it's like, I don't know, 19th century French literature or Russian linguistics. You're just like, what is this? And it really is it puts the kind of responsibility back to the potential author. Do your homework. Just go and look at what they publish. Like, it's embarrassing. It's just like just go look. It's not that hard. Just take a look.
It's like what I said, these brilliant scholars, they've worked so hard for years and years and years doing research in the most difficult situations and circumstances sometimes, and then sort of stop being scholars all of a sudden when it comes to the press, thinking we all publish the same things. I shouldn't say we so far away,
but it's
I
true.
was,
Yeah,
I was
it's
an
true.
acquiring editor for a very long time, and I loved the work, and I think I was good at it. So
you won a lot of awards.
The other one,
my books did,
the other one I'll point out too, and it's not maybe it's a pet peeve, but it's one of the things that I tell authors, and it goes with scholarly monographs, but don't think of it as I'm going to give you the book and then I'm just going to sit back and let you do it. Like, when it comes to, and then all of a sudden your book doesn't do very well, you're like, why didn't it do well? Well, it's like what we need with authors, and we think about this in-house, is authors that are going to enter a partnership with us when it comes to promoting, marketing their book. And for a monograph, that comes down to just, do you go to the conferences? Do you know what I mean? Are you going to go out and give a paper that is, connected to your book? Are you going to be there talking to your colleagues? For more trade books, we really think about that. It's like, are you going to go and do book talks? Are you going to get on social media increasingly? Are you going to do all this kind of stuff to help promote your book? Because we have so many books, and like all of us in higher education, we're strapped for the people.
Right.
So we also think in seasons too. Like, when it comes out in the fall, winter, by the spring, summer of that next year, we've moved on. Like, if you want your book to have life, you need to help us. There are some books that take a life of their own. But in general, we need the author to really, really help promote the book. And so it's not really a pet peeve, but it's like an expectation that, again, you want to talk to your editor about it. And it's one of those things I would want an editor to mention to you if you're pitching your book. It's like, we need your help.
Right. Yeah, that's a hard thing as a scholar or a writer, is like, you have to be able to promote yourself. And most of us are, I don't want to say introverts, we're used, but most of us are very reticent to talk to other people or put ourselves out there. I know I am.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's led to some people who were successful writers. I'm thinking about a guy, what was his name? He started the journal Ecotone. He was a great, funny nature writer, which is a very unusual thing, but he was quite successful. And he said to me one time, we were at a conference, and he said, I didn't want to publish any more books. I'm so sick of promoting my work, because it's a lot of work to get out there, send those messages, go to, she left to conferences and stuff. So, I'm sympathetic with the challenge, but that's partly why you sometimes look at the platform too, to just say, is this person out there? Are they known? Sometimes you do have that sort of shy, secretive scholar who's so smart and so brilliant, and you're like, okay, this guy's going to help, or this woman's not going to help us at all. And you warn your marketing department about that, and you maybe then have to sort of step in and say, you should try to get it out to this listserv, or that's an old thing, listservs. But anyway, we kind of know these people, and so sometimes we do step in and do a little something extra, but that's rare. And I think there is a kind of fantasy for all of us who are writers, that the Maxwell Perkins thing, that there's this editor that's going to devote their entire life to nothing but you and your mess, and they're going to make you famous, and they're going to make your ideas known. Boy, if you find that, you found a unicorn, because it's just, I don't think it really existed in the past that much either. I think that was quite exceptional, and it's been made much of in mainstream media. But I think a lot of people do think that that's going to happen, and so that's kind of where the realistic picture. We'll have I would have a young scholar who would have a great idea, and it's going to get. You should market this as a trade book, because everybody's going to buy it, and everybody I know is going to buy it. There's just like 200 people. If you're really honest about it, how many people do we really know who will buy a monograph? So that's reputable, but don't think it's going to be a trade book, because the discounts are different, and the press will lose tremendous amounts of money if they believe it. And so, just lining up expectations. That's a lot of the work we do, is, like you said, under promising and over delivering. That was my strategy too. I was very nervous about young editors who really made promises they could not keep. And I knew that they were not only going to let down scholars, but they were going to lose cred with the rest of the press.
Right.
And it sets you up to fail. And so you do not want an editor that lies to you. You want someone that's going to tell you the hard truth, that they're going to make sure your book succeeds in the best possible way.
Sure.
So I have a question about, there's been so many publications that have been bought out by like the larger publications, and many of them don't want to do the hard copy books anymore. They just want to do like the e-books, books and or the print. How is that different or similar to what is happening at university presses?
So historically, what you would do is you do a cloth edition. So
Right.
that's what you're talking about. And I mean,
Nobody's really.
well, so bringing up the discount and the money, that kind of stuff. One of the reasons we would do cloth editions is because you could charge more for them. And the thinking was, if you're a very dedicated person to that subject area, whatever, you'll pay the $45 for the cloth edition. So we would do short runs of the cloth edition, or smaller print runs, call it. And then, once that had its life, we'd come up with a paperback. And then we could charge less for it, and hopefully get a larger readership that's not as dedicated. there are presses that still do that. We've never done that at UMass. We go right to paper because we
Really?
want to, yeah, and because we want to keep it as affordable as we can right away. And what'll happen, and I'm sure some might have heard this, I know this, is I know people that have this, they're like, well, they did a cloth edition and it never sold out, so they still haven't done the paperback.
Yes.
Yep. I know people like that. In fact, I tried to pick up some paperback rights from Basic not too long ago from somebody I know, a very well-known scholar who did the cloth edition. Basic did the cloth. No offense to Basic, they did the cloth edition and it never sold out, so they never did the paper.
Mhm.
So it can actually be more beneficial to go right to paper. In fact, it's one of those questions I tell people to ask the editor. How do you do that? You know, what do you do? Cloth edition? Do you how do you make those decisions? Because it can be based off books too. It can be title by title. Do you know what I mean? Like if it's a monograph that we think is going to be hopefully course adoption. Boy, those were the days.
Right.
Who has course adoption anymore? You know, we would really want to go to paper. We think there's any kind of chance that there might be an audience for hardcover. We don't do any hardcover at Massachusetts. I mean, maybe once in a while we'll do one, but
We did do them.
Yeah,
right.
There. And you know, it is, these are the big discussions. This is what, you know, you don't know when you send your book in, you just think it's just a book, it's gonna be published. But publication strategy is really a huge part of the questions. And a lot of it, we would do a split run, sometimes separate. Assuming that the more serious people wanted that cloth edition, 200 of them that sort of earn back some of the cost of production. So the paperback could be less expensive. If you go right to paper, we felt a lot of times you had to earn those production costs back out of the paper, which you couldn't price quite as high as you wanted, but you still were pricing it higher than you might want. So, you know, all of that becomes really a kind of, that's where we're a business working in a bureaucracy. And it's tough because you are making, you know, people have described, I think accurately, publishing as a casino. It's a really risky, high-risk gambling business. And you're spending a lot of money on something that may or may not have legs and may or may not have a life in backlist, which is where the money's going to come from. And so, and we're not talking about huge dollars here, you know, it's usually pretty small. So it's fascinating. I mean, you know, that's what makes it a really great place to work, because you always have these kind of interesting conversations and challenges. So
Before I open up to,
I was just gonna say, like, one thing, like, as a buyer of books for a library, when you're talking about the cloth versus the paperback, like, a lot of times, like, we will purchase paperback, right, because we have a limited budget.
libraries really led a lot of the change here, because when your budget's cut, we adapted our strategies around that. Those have been reliable buyers of monographs.
Yeah, and so for scholarly publications, like, libraries are probably your biggest clients.
Absolutely,
As opposed
absolutely.
to some of the trade, so kind of.
But it all did come down to budgets. And so, you know, there were big shifts just as I was starting at the press. That's when a lot of that stuff started changing. And so I remember watching the strategies becoming more and more toward paper.
So we used to find budgets at Massachusetts with our predecessors where they would write off 1,000 copies to the libraries right up the top. It's now zero.
really,
Zero. Wow. We still
don't-
at least had some sales.
This is now it's a very different environment.
That trickled down, you know, and a lot of the from what I understand, the budget pressure in buying was from electronic databases, from needing to buy the expensive. Yeah. So
And the decline of people reading print books, right?
Yeah.
Reading,
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
it's
The
just,
online.
it's so.
Very different
interesting.
environment.
It's very-
So
so I was gonna ask Connie if you can speak to, you kind of started, but acquiring books, and a little bit about the repositories and copyright, that stuff that you're concerned with.
Yeah, no, so after, you know, you all do the work of getting the book out there and marketing it, right? Like, someone needs to buy it.
Yep.
So, as like a librarian, we have collection budgets And so ways we make decisions about buying which books to buy, right? As you know, we have a system called Gobi where all the books are kind of put into it. And so they can create lists, you know, of books on business or engineering or biology. And so we can kind of look through those. But we also go through book reviews as well. So one of the biggest ones we use is something called choice reviews. It's book reviews put out by ACRL. And so, you know, we'll review books. I will sometimes try and go find university presses that, you know, print or that publish books related to business, which is I'm the business librarian. So, you know, we kind of work through that list. And then at a small school like us, it's not an R1, books that we tend to buy try to fit within the curriculum that's taught, as opposed to just being broad overarching research, right? So depending on the library where you're at will determine like the level of buying. And R1s with large book budgets can pretty much buy almost anything. Smaller institutions really have to focus on how they're going to, what are they going to prioritize? And here at Pittsburgh State, the priority is on having books and resources that support the teaching curriculum for a large part of it.
So I do review books for choice.
What do you do?
I do try to be honest.
Mhm.
So I will give reviews saying, no, this is not a good book for most libraries. Yes, the purpose of choice reviews is they want to know which libraries might this be useful for, which audiences. And so it's not, the goal is not to butter people up and say, oh, this is wonderful. So occasionally I might say, well, this could be, they have a whole checklist. This could be good for a research library. Occasionally I'll say, this looks great for everyone, right? Depends.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
pay?
Well, I give the book.
That's it, okay.
It's really not, it's actually pretty good. I mean, you get books and the reviews are short. They're not like super long reviews because it's really kind of user friendly. You know, is this book going to be useful for us and which kind of libraries will it be useful for?
Yeah, it's one of those things they do is they'll say it's geared towards undergraduates, you know, or we're a 2-year curriculum or advanced undergrad, you know, so you can use that to gauge. If you don't have a graduate program like on that topic, then you probably aren't going to buy the book.
Any other questions? From, sure, yeah.
Right, at the beginning, you said you want to talk about ownership rights.
Oh, yeah. So what I know of rights is probably limited, looking at it from a writer's point of view. When I sign contracts, mostly if it's an article or a short piece, they usually they'll usually only want first American or first North American or first rights. And then the rights revert back to me so I can do what I want with them. So for instance, we're starting a repository at the library, and just to see how it works, I publish some or republish some stuff on the library to see if it goes up. I don't have to get permission from the original publishers, but a lot of times when I republish things, I do credit them, like this was first published in blah, 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 and the acknowledgements. But sometimes you don't have those rights. Sometimes, especially with academic things, correct me if I'm wrong.
Some journals too.
Some
You
journals,
need to look at your contract.
yeah,
And you can negotiate a contract. But you know, we take world rights in English, not just North American anymore.
okay. Wow.
And but rights revert on publication. We do ask that they always credit us and acknowledge us. So that's not just a
So-
courtesy.
You're only the author, we have to give up first publishing rights.
Yeah.
They're allowed to be published later.
Yeah.
You could put it in your own collection, but you should always
This is what the
acknowledge
magazine-
the original publisher. Not all magazines do that though. So, you know, some do still collect some royalties from their previous publications. They share them with the writer after a certain point. So Craig Schooner was like that. And they made quite a lot of money with reprint rights. But Ploughshares has probably been done not to do it, but we have never done that. So I've carried on that tradition. Whereas like at university presses, I publish my books with university presses. I retain copyright in my name, but I don't retain rights. If I want to reprint something, I would have to get permission from my son, who is now the subsidiary rights director there. After I left, but that is our, if I were to go to Nebraska, so, something like that, I have to work through.
Yeah, I think it's really important to read your author contract and see what rights are retained and which ones you kind of transferred over. So
And there are some very, I'm gonna just be really blunt, so I think predatory contracts happening right now in university presses. I had 2 instances where we had poets who, we accepted their poems. The issue was going to come out before their book came out, but their university press considered their contract as publication. And so they wanted us to give them credit as the first publisher. And I said, I absolutely will not do that. And they thought I was crazy. And I was like, I don't know what planet you live on, but we are going to be the first publishers and we're not in the business of reprinting. And I don't care if you waive the fee, but you didn't publish this. The contract is not a publication. So I think there's some really interesting things going on in university press publishing right now. And I had a friend that I was looking over her contracts in a couple of different presses. And one of them I said, I wouldn't publish with this house. It was a very small press, but it was such a strange publication. We did her such a strange contract. She went ahead and worked with them and her book almost didn't come out. It was really crazy. So you do need to be really careful. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to sign away some rights. You're going to give up, you don't have the rights anymore. But don't give up things you don't need to give up. And so that's my advice.
there's a website called Think, Check, Submit, which provides checklists for books and journals to kind of make a determination as to whether or not they're predatory journals. Publishers. Think, check, I think it's Think, Check,
Predatory journals.
Submit. Think, check, submit. I think it's thinkchecksubmit.org. I can give the URL.
That's really interesting.
It is.
Predatory journals.
But I think online, there's probably a lot of internet publication now that can be pretty fast and free with weird contracts and, but I was shocked to see it in a university press.
Yeah.
So I think people are being hired from outside of, sort of the traditional route.
Other questions?
Anybody else?
I have a question for a student. Like, if I wanted to get into publishing, if I wanted to work in acquisitions or as a copy editor, what would my first step be?
Internship.
Yeah, so it is an apprenticeship profession. It's usually an internship. That's usually the best way to get into. That's how I started, an internship. And now I think internships are there's a greater way to get internships that are far away. Because it's Zoom.
How you can get,
When I started, I had to be in the city. I started at Minnesota Historical Society Press, but I think now there's probably more ability to be
Yeah, we've had
remote.
interns. We've had remote
Right,
interns.
right. So that's usually the way to get into publishing.
Yeah, I was a volunteer reader for Prairie Schooner for 5 years.
Yeah.
And then when they needed a managing editor, they asked me. So,
Yeah,
you can't all do that, but that was a lot of hours out of my life. I liked it. It was good for me. And I worked with a lot of interns and editorial assistants at University of Nebraska Press who are now directors of programs and editors in chief. So it definitely is when people know you and trust you, and other university presses, if they see that you've worked in university press, they feel like, oh, okay, this is a person that's been vetted. We're in there, so I'm looking at you as though you're, I'm assuming you're a student.
yeah. And another question I have, piggybacking, because you're also a business, not an English major, and this is what I wanted to make clear. And I think my colleagues none of them are here, would hate me for saying this, but you don't have to be an English major to,
No.
of course, like, in academic publishing, you want people with those diverse backgrounds, so like,
Absolutely.
psychology.
A lot of it is business stuff.
Or
You know, if you're a
psychology.
business
Yeah.
person, you know, we require, if somebody's there paying the royalties, we're
Right.
figuring that out. I mean, that's a business position. And so a lot of directors come from a business background or marketing or any other positions.
So a couple of the things with that, and I would say, especially with acquisitions, it can sometimes be not good to acquire in your field. Sometimes because you don't know what you're going to potentially be acquiring. And I've heard, especially with PhDs, that there can be people that shy away from somebody because they just want to kind of reproduce what their scholarship is, and it's like that's not what this job is. You've got to be ready to acquire in things that you don't know anything about. You know,
Well, you have to be a kind of person that doesn't mind getting hit upside the head every day by how much you don't know. I had to work, that's why you have peer reviewers. Everybody you're working with is smarter in that field than you are. And you have to be comfortable with that. A certain amount of being a generalist and being, you know, just, okay, wow, this whole world exists that I didn't know existed, and be okay with it.
Exactly. And I can say, and this is with most jobs, but it's sort of like you might be able to figure out what the position you want in the press is to do. Like I wanted to be acquisitions, but you might not get that right away. So you
Right.
have to do other things. So I know there's acquisitions editors who started marketing. You know, they get to it in other ways. And I can just tell you too, like when I finished my PhD, I had the internship at Minnesota Historical Society Press, and I knew I wanted to be an acquisitions editor. And I thought, oh, keys to the kingdom. Like they're gonna be coming all over me, you know, like it's gonna be like coming. So I applied to these and I knew university presses. I was very specific on it. I applied to university presses, acquisitions editors, didn't get a thing. Not one interview. And I was like, oh, well, now what am I going to do? So I discovered, and again, this is, I think, with many professions, is if you don't, people don't like to hear that you're the plan B. You know what I mean? Like that you're the alternate. And what they want to see is real world experience. Do you know what I mean? So I had to start basically at an editorial, and I wasn't an editorial assistant. I was assistant editor, rights and permissions coordinator at Wayne State, but it was the very bottom. I had just finished a PhD, like in one of the better American Studies programs in the country, and I was just like, okay. But I knew that if I wanted to move up, I had to start and actually have real experience in the field. They weren't just going to give me the big job right away. So again, get any job in publishing, any job.
And go do anything. I one time had an intern at Prairie Schooner who was too good to actually put issues in envelopes to me. And I noted, because it wasn't too, the editor-in-chief and I, the managing editor, were not too good to do it, but good to know.
I still do it.
And
I'm
do it.
still
That's
like
the
way
thing.
in the manuscript, printing it off.
It has to be done. The work has to be done. And prima donnas just, they're not gonna last. And also people get to know you and they know that you're someone who shows up, you're someone who's honest, you're someone who just, does the work. And so I just can't tell you how much that matters and how many, many times, things change quickly, unlike academia where things don't change quickly. Presses change quickly and you need somebody to fill in and do this thing. And you know that editorial assistant has been really spot on, great. They're probably going to be a good internal candidate. Happened over and over for us. And so, yeah, can't say that enough.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank our guests and let's.
Thanks for
Thank you so much to Misty.
Yeah, thank
Well,
you, Misty.
Together.
nice to get here. We live like 20 minutes.
I
apart.
know, and I think all the time. Thank you.
She just moved out of Boston 2 years ago, so we lived in Boston. And I'm really sorry about that, but
I live in Hubbard, Jim, I think I'm
yeah. So, but I just had no idea that the rest was in here.
Oh,
I've been doing this since